Something happened the moment your soulmate heard your voice again, and they were not prepared for the reaction that came before they could even think about it. It may have been only a few seconds. Maybe they heard you speaking in a video, came across an old voice note, heard you unexpectedly through someone else, or simply caught the sound of your voice after a long period of silence. But something inside them recognized you instantly. Before they could explain it, before they could tell themselves that enough time had passed, an old emotion moved through them like it had been waiting quietly beneath the surface. And that is the part they weren't expecting. They thought they had become used to your absence. They thought your voice had become just another memory, something belonging to a chapter they had already closed. But the moment they heard that familiar tone, those familiar pauses, that familiar way you said certain words, something changed. It was almost as if their heart recognized you before their mind had permission to react. Have you ever heard a song after years and suddenly remembered exactly who you were when you first heard it? Not just the song, but the room, the atmosphere, the feeling, the person you were with, and everything you thought you had forgotten. Your voice may have done something similar to them. It didn't simply remind them of what you sounded like. It reminded them of how they felt when you were still part of their everyday world. And they may have tried to push that reaction away almost immediately. They may have thought, why did that affect me? Or even, I thought I was completely over this. But emotions don't always disappear just because someone stops talking about them. Sometimes they become quiet. Sometimes they hide underneath routine, distance, pride, and the decision to keep moving forward. Then one familiar sound can reach a place that ordinary memories never could. You might be wondering why hearing your voice could possibly affect them more than seeing your name or remembering your face. Because a voice carries something photographs cannot. It carries warmth, rhythm, emotion, hesitation, laughter, and the exact feeling of being spoken to by someone who once mattered deeply. And suddenly, for a moment, your soulmate wasn't remembering the past from a distance. They were emotionally standing inside it again. That is why the reaction may have surprised them. They didn't expect to miss the sound of you. They didn't expect their chest to feel different. They didn't expect old feelings to become present again. But something they believed was gone may have only been sleeping, and your voice just woke it up. What happened after that first reaction is where things became much harder for your soulmate to explain, because hearing your voice was only the beginning. The moment passed, but the feeling didn't. They may have continued with whatever they were doing, tried to act normal, answered another message, went back to work, talked to someone, or simply told themselves that it was nothing. But somewhere in the background, your voice kept replaying inside their mind. And that is when their logical side probably stepped in. They may have tried to explain the reaction away. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe they were simply surprised. Maybe hearing you after so long brought back an old memory and nothing more. They may have even told themselves it doesn't mean anything. Everyone gets emotional when they hear something familiar, but the problem was that their reaction didn't feel ordinary. Something about hearing you again reached them differently. It wasn't simply recognition. It was familiarity mixed with emotion, and that combination can be incredibly powerful when it comes from someone who once held a meaningful place in your life. They may have been surprised by how quickly their minds started filling in the missing pieces. Your voice reminded them of conversations they hadn't thought about in a long time. It reminded them of the way you used to say their name. It reminded them of the little pauses between your words, the moments when you laughed unexpectedly, the tone you used when you were serious, playful, worried, or trying to hide something. They may not consciously remember every conversation anymore, but their emotional memory can still recognize the feeling attached to your voice. Imagine walking through a city you haven't visited in years and suddenly hearing a sound from one particular street. You don't need a map to know where you are. Something inside you already knows. One sound can bring an entire place back. That is what your voice may have done to them. It became a shortcut through time. They didn't have to consciously search for memories because the sound carried them there. And perhaps that is why they became quieter afterward. They weren't necessarily trying to avoid you. They may have been trying to understand themselves. They may have wondered why something so simple could create such a strong emotional reaction. Why did their mood change? Why did they suddenly remember things they hadn't intentionally thought about? Why did their minds start returning to moments they had carefully placed in the past? These questions can become uncomfortable because they challenge the story someone has been telling themselves. Your soulmate may have spent a long time believing that they had moved on. Maybe they weren't thinking about you every day anymore. Maybe they had built new routines, met new people, focused on different responsibilities, and learned how to continue without your presence. From the outside, everything may have looked completely normal. But moving forward doesn't always mean every emotion has disappeared. Sometimes it simply means you have learned how to live without touching the part of yourself that still remembers. Then your voice came back, and for a few seconds that distance became much smaller. It may have felt almost unfair to them. They had worked hard to become comfortable with the silence, and suddenly one familiar sound reminded them that comfort and closure are not always the same thing. You might be wondering, why would they remember the feeling before they remembered the actual conversation? Because emotions are often stored differently from ordinary facts. You may forget exactly what someone said years ago, but remember how safe you felt hearing their voice. You may forget the date of a conversation, but remember the warmth of being understood. You may forget the details of a particular evening, but remember how someone made you feel when you were struggling. Your voice may have carried that emotional signature for them, and once they heard it again, their mind didn't simply retrieve information. It retrieved an atmosphere, a feeling, a version of themselves. Perhaps they remembered what it felt like to have someone they could speak to without constantly measuring every word. Perhaps they remembered the comfort of being listened to. Perhaps they remembered how easy certain conversations once felt. Or maybe they remembered something even simpler, the feeling of hearing someone familiar at the end of a difficult day. Those things can seem insignificant while they are happening because we assume they will always be available. We don't realize the emotional value of ordinary moments until they become memories. And this may be exactly what your soulmate is confronting now. They may be realizing that they didn't miss some dramatic event. They missed the ordinary presence of you. They missed the sound that used to exist naturally in their life. They may even be asking themselves, why does this still feel familiar? And how can someone I haven't heard in so long still sound like home? That second question is where the emotion becomes deeper. Because when someone feels emotionally familiar after a long absence, it can reveal how deeply they were integrated into your internal world. And your soulmate may now be recognizing that you were not simply a person they talked to. You became associated with certain emotional states inside them. Your voice may have represented comfort, excitement, trust, affection, safety, or simply the feeling of being understood. That is why hearing it again could feel almost like finding something they thought they had lost. Imagine opening an old room that has been locked for years. You expect dust, silence, maybe a few forgotten objects. But the moment you open the door, the scent of that room brings everything back. You remember who you were there. You remember what happened there. You remember how it felt to exist in that space. Your soulmate's experience may have been similar. Your voice opened a door they thought had been permanently closed. And suddenly, memories that seemed distant became emotionally close again. They may have remembered your conversations, but more importantly, they may have remembered themselves during those conversations. That distinction matters. Sometimes we don't miss a person only because of who they were. We miss who we were when we were around them. Maybe they were softer with you. Maybe they laughed more freely. Maybe they talked about things they normally kept hidden. Maybe they didn't have to pretend to have everything figured out. Your voice could have reminded them of that version of themselves, and that can be incredibly emotional because time changes people. They may have grown, adapted, become more guarded, or learned to protect themselves differently. But for a brief moment, hearing you may have made that older version of them feel close again. And now they have a strange contradiction inside them. Their mind may be saying, "That was the past," while their emotions are quietly responding, "But why does it still feel present?" They may try to distract themselves from the feeling, but the more they resist understanding it, the more curious they can become. They may replay the moment mentally. They may wonder whether you sounded different. They may wonder whether you remembered them too. They may even start thinking about what would happen if they heard you again, not because they have already decided what they want, but because the first encounter awakened curiosity along with emotion. And that is where this story becomes much deeper than simply hearing an old familiar voice. Your soulmate may have discovered that time changed the circumstances, but it did not necessarily erase the emotional imprint. They thought silence meant the feeling was gone. But hearing you again showed them that silence can sometimes hide things rather than destroy them. The emotion may have been buried beneath years of ordinary life, but it was still connected to you. And now they are left with a realization they may not be ready to say out loud, "I thought I had forgotten how this felt." But they didn't. They remembered the moment they heard you. They remembered the feeling that came with it. And somewhere inside them, a question has begun forming that they may not be able to ignore for much longer. If one brief sound could bring all of this back, then what exactly did they ever truly let go of? And this is where the reaction becomes impossible for them to dismiss, because what returned wasn't simply a memory of you. It was an emotion they genuinely believed had disappeared. They may have spent months or even years convincing themselves that whatever they once felt had faded naturally with time. They stopped expecting your name to affect them. They stopped looking for signs of you. They stopped wondering what you were doing. They learned how to continue with life without asking whether you might return. And then, unexpectedly, they heard your voice again. Suddenly, something they had carefully placed in the past moved into the present. Not because they consciously invited it back, but because some emotions don't leave when you stop thinking about them. They simply become quiet. They settle underneath everything else, waiting for the right sound, the right memory, the right moment to remind you that they were never completely gone. And your voice may have been that moment for them. They may have felt an emotion rise so quickly that it almost confused them. Maybe it was tenderness. Maybe it was longing. Maybe it was affection mixed with regret. Maybe it was the strange ache of realizing that someone you once had close is now far away. Whatever the emotion was, the important part is that they recognized it. They knew that feeling. They had felt it around you before. And that recognition may have frightened them more than the emotion itself. Because if the feeling returned that quickly, then what does that say about everything they had been telling themselves? They may have thought, "No, this can't still be here." They may have tried to push it away. But the heart doesn't always follow the timeline the mind creates. You can decide that a chapter is over, but your emotions may still remember certain pages. Imagine an ember buried beneath layers of ash. From the outside, everything looks cold. There is no flame, no smoke, no visible sign that anything remains. Then one small breath reaches the right place, and suddenly a tiny orange glow appears. The breath didn't create the fire. It revealed that something was still alive underneath. Your voice may have been that breath. It didn't necessarily create a new emotion in your soulmate. It may have revealed an old one that had never completely disappeared. And that realization can be deeply unsettling, because they may have believed they were finally free from the emotional weight of your connection. They may have believed they had made peace with what happened. But now they're wondering whether they made peace or simply learned how to avoid touching the wound. There is a difference. Peace feels settled. Avoidance feels quiet until something reminds you. Hearing you again may have shown them which one they were actually experiencing. And perhaps the most surprising part is that the emotion may not have appeared as dramatic sadness. Sometimes deep feelings return through small changes. They become distracted. They become unusually thoughtful. They replay the moment in their head. They find themselves smiling at something they haven't remembered in years. They suddenly want to know how you are. They may wonder whether your life changed, whether you still sound the same, whether you still remember the things they once told you. They may not even understand why these questions appeared so suddenly. But the emotional door has opened, and now their mind is walking through it. They may start remembering moments they hadn't considered important before. A conversation that lasted longer than expected. A joke that only the two of you understood. A time when you noticed something nobody else did. The way you responded when they were vulnerable. The sound of your laughter. The way your voice changed when you were excited about something. These details may return because the brain doesn't always store emotional experiences as isolated facts. It connects them together. One sensory trigger can unlock an entire network of memories. That's why a voice can be so powerful. It doesn't just tell you who someone is. It can remind you how it felt to be around them. And your soulmate may suddenly be remembering the emotional environment that existed between you. Maybe there was comfort there. Maybe there was chemistry. Maybe there was a feeling of being seen. Maybe there was something unfinished. Whatever it was, they are now confronting it from a different place in life. Time changes perspective. Things that seemed ordinary when they were happening can look precious once they are gone. A person can spend years assuming they will always have another conversation, another opportunity, another chance to say what they really mean. Then distance happens. Life moves forward. Circumstances change. And suddenly, the ordinary becomes something you would give anything to experience one more time. Your soulmate may now be recognizing that your voice was part of an emotional world they didn't fully appreciate while they were living inside it. Imagine standing outside a house you once lived in. At the time you noticed the problems, the noise, the imperfections, all the things you wanted to change. But years later you pass by and suddenly remember the warmth of the kitchen, the sound of people talking, the feeling of coming home. The house hasn't changed your memory. Your distance changed your perspective. That may be what is happening inside them now. They aren't necessarily romanticizing every part of the past. They may be recognizing what was genuinely meaningful. And that can create a painful question. Did I understand what I had while I had it? They may think about moments where they could have been more open. They may remember times when pride prevented them from saying something important. They may remember opportunities they ignored because they assumed there would always be another one. And now your voice has made those moments feel alive again. But here's where you need to understand the emotional complexity of this situation. A returning emotion does not automatically mean your soulmate knows what to do with it. They can miss you and still be afraid. They can care about you and still hesitate. They can feel something deeply and still not know whether reaching out is the right decision. Sometimes the hardest part isn't realizing that you still feel something. It's figuring out what that feeling means now. Maybe they are wondering whether it is love or nostalgia. Maybe it is regret. Maybe it is unfinished attachment. Maybe it is simply the recognition that you mattered more than they admitted. They may be asking themselves questions they haven't allowed themselves to ask in a long time. Why did hearing them affect me like that? Why do I suddenly want to know how they're doing? Why does their voice still feel familiar? Did I really move on, or did I just become better at not thinking about it? Those questions are powerful because they force honesty. And honesty is exactly what your soulmate may have been avoiding. They may have been comfortable with the version of the story where everything ended, everyone moved forward, and nothing remained unresolved. But your voice disrupted that comfortable narrative. It reminded them that emotions don't always follow endings. Sometimes a connection can become silent without becoming meaningless. Sometimes people stop speaking without completely stopping caring. Sometimes distance changes access, not significance. And now your soulmate may be realizing that the emotion they thought was gone wasn't destroyed. It was simply waiting for something familiar enough to wake it. Your voice did exactly that. It reached a part of them that time had covered but never erased. And perhaps they are now sitting with a feeling they can't name yet, because naming it would make it real. Maybe they aren't ready to admit that they still care. Maybe they aren't ready to admit that they miss you. Maybe they aren't ready to admit that some part of their heart still responds to you. But they felt something. They know they felt something. And once you feel something that strongly after believing it was gone, it becomes very difficult to pretend you never felt it at all. The silence may have hidden the emotion, but hearing you again brought it into the light. And now, whether they act on it or simply sit quietly with the realization, they have to face a truth they weren't expecting. Sometimes the heart doesn't forget a meaningful connection. It simply waits until the right moment to remember exactly how it felt. And now comes the part they may be struggling with the most. Because after the emotion returned, your soulmate didn't just start thinking about you. They started remembering who they were when you were in their life. That is a much deeper realization. Sometimes we believe we miss a person, but what we are actually missing is the version of ourselves that existed around them. Your voice may have opened that door for them. Suddenly, they weren't only remembering your conversations. They were remembering how easily they used to talk to you, how certain things felt natural, how they could laugh without thinking about it, how they could reveal parts of themselves they usually kept hidden. And that realization can hit unexpectedly hard, because time may have changed them. They may have become more guarded, more careful, more independent, or simply accustomed to handling everything alone. But for a brief moment, hearing your voice reminded them of another version of themselves, one that perhaps felt softer, more open, more emotionally alive. Imagine finding an old photograph of yourself and realizing you don't just remember the people in the picture. You remember exactly who you were when it was taken. The clothes, the place, the expression on your face, the dreams you had, the things you believed were possible. Your soulmate may have experienced something similar through your voice. You didn't just bring back a memory of yourself. You brought back an entire emotional chapter. And now they may be asking a question they didn't expect to ask. Why did I feel more like myself when I was talking to them? That question can be more powerful than simply wondering whether they still miss you, because it forces them to look at what your connection actually gave them. Maybe they felt understood without needing to explain everything. Maybe they felt emotionally safe enough to be honest. Maybe they felt noticed in ways they didn't realize they needed. Maybe your presence made ordinary moments feel lighter. These things are easy to underestimate while they are happening. We often recognize the value of emotional safety only after we experience its absence. And your soulmate may now be comparing that old feeling with the life they have built since then. Not necessarily because everything around them is wrong, but because they have suddenly remembered a specific kind of connection that is difficult to replace. They may begin replaying conversations in their mind, wondering why certain memories feel warmer now than they did before. They may remember the way you listened, the way you reacted when they were vulnerable, or the way your voice could change their mood without you even realizing it. Perhaps they remember moments when you stayed on the phone longer than necessary because neither of you wanted the conversation to end. Perhaps they remember silence that never felt uncomfortable. Perhaps they remember the simple feeling of knowing someone was there. And those memories can become surprisingly emotional when you realize you no longer have automatic access to them. It's like discovering the value of a familiar light only after spending enough time in darkness. You may have been ordinary to each other in the moment, but distance can reveal the extraordinary hidden inside ordinary moments. Your soulmate may also be confronting regret. Not necessarily dramatic regret, but the quiet kind. The kind that asks, what if I had handled things differently? What if they had said more? What if they had listened better? What if they hadn't allowed pride, fear, timing, or circumstances to create so much distance? What if they had understood what they had while they still had it? Those questions don't always lead immediately to action, but they can completely change the emotional meaning of the past. And that is why hearing your voice again may have affected them more deeply than they expected. It gave the past a heartbeat. Suddenly something they had categorized as over felt emotionally alive again. But here's what makes this even more complicated. They may not know whether the feeling belongs to the past or the present. They may wonder whether they miss the person you were, or whether they are beginning to recognize the person you have become. They may be curious about how much you've changed. Do you still laugh the same way? Do you still speak with that same warmth? Would talking to you now feel familiar or completely different? These questions can create a quiet tension inside someone because curiosity is often the first sign that an emotional door has reopened. Imagine standing in front of a familiar house years after leaving it. You don't know what's inside anymore. The walls may look different. The rooms may have changed. The people may have changed. But something about the doorway still feels familiar. That's where your soulmate may be emotionally standing right now. They know they cannot simply walk backward into the past. Too much has happened. Both of you have changed. But hearing your voice may have made them wonder whether the connection itself still has a place in the present. And that question can stay with someone much longer than the initial emotional reaction. They may not tell anyone about it. They may keep it private, because admitting that your voice still affects them would mean admitting that the story isn't as emotionally simple as they once believed. They may act normal while secretly replaying the moment. They may tell themselves they are only remembering, while another part of them is quietly wondering what would happen if you spoke again. And perhaps the deepest realization is this: they aren't necessarily longing for the past exactly as it was. They may be longing for the feeling that existed between you, while wondering whether something similar could exist again in a different form. That is why this moment matters. Your voice didn't simply make them nostalgic. It reminded them of an emotional truth they had stopped examining. You mattered. The connection mattered. And even if they still don't know what comes next, they can no longer pretend that hearing you again meant nothing. Something inside them responded before they could control it. Something remembered before they could rationalize it. And now they are left with the uncomfortable but strangely beautiful realization that perhaps the part of them that loved, trusted, or deeply cared for you never completely disappeared. It simply became quiet, and hearing your voice gave it a reason to speak again. And now we arrive at the truth your soulmate may have been trying hardest not to face, because the most surprising part was never that they heard your voice again. It was what that voice revealed about them. They thought time had settled everything. They thought distance had softened the memories, changed the emotions, and eventually made your connection feel like something that belonged entirely to another chapter. Maybe they had even convinced themselves that if they weren't thinking about you every day, then they must have completely moved on. But then your voice reached them again, and for a brief moment that entire story became difficult to believe. They didn't simply recognize the sound. They recognized the feeling attached to it. And that is where everything changed. Imagine finding an old letter inside a drawer you haven't opened for years. You expect to read the words and feel nothing because so much time has passed. But the moment you see the handwriting, something inside you shifts. Suddenly the person doesn't feel distant anymore. Their presence returns through something as simple as ink on paper. Your voice may have done exactly that for your soulmate. It brought your emotional presence back into a moment where they thought you no longer belonged. And perhaps the hardest question they are now asking themselves is, if I was truly over this, why did hearing them still affect me? They may not have an immediate answer. They may try to explain it as nostalgia. They may tell themselves that anyone would react emotionally to something familiar. But deep down, they know there was something different about their reaction. It wasn't just a memory passing through their mind. It lingered. It changed their mood. It made them think. It may have even made them wonder what you are doing now, whether you have changed, whether you ever think about them, and whether the connection still means anything to you. That curiosity is important because it shows that the emotion didn't simply return and disappear. It created questions, and questions are often where emotional realization begins. Your soulmate may now be looking backward with a completely different perspective. They may remember moments they once dismissed and suddenly understand their value. They may remember how you spoke to them when they were struggling. They may remember the patience you had, the way you noticed small things, the way conversations could continue without either of you forcing them. They may remember the sound of your laughter, the little changes in your voice when you were excited or emotional, and perhaps even the way you said their name. Those details may have seemed ordinary at the time, but now they carry a different weight because they are no longer guaranteed to happen again. And sometimes absence teaches us what presence never had to explain. You don't always realize how deeply someone became part of your emotional world until something brings that person back for a moment. That's what your voice may have done. It reminded them that there was once a place in their life where hearing you was normal, where talking to you was easy, where your presence didn't require an invitation. Now they are experiencing that contrast. Before, your voice was part of life. Now hearing it feels like an event, and that difference can be powerful. They may be wondering whether they miss you specifically, or whether they miss the feeling of being understood by you. But perhaps the answer is not as separate as they think. Sometimes we miss a person because of the emotional space that only existed with them. You may have represented comfort, trust, excitement, tenderness, safety, or a version of love they haven't experienced in exactly the same way since. And when your voice returned, that emotional space opened again. It may have felt almost like stepping into a room they had forgotten existed. They didn't realize how much they missed the room until they were standing inside it again. But there is something else your soulmate may be realizing now. They can't use time as proof anymore. Time passed, yes. Life continued, yes. But time did not erase everything. It simply changed the way the emotion lived inside them. Maybe they stopped consciously carrying it. Maybe they buried it under responsibilities, new experiences, other relationships, or the daily demands of life. But buried doesn't always mean gone. Sometimes the deepest feelings are simply the ones we stop touching because we don't know what would happen if we did. And your voice touched that place. It may have reminded them of something they had been avoiding, that some connections don't end emotionally at the exact moment they end physically. People can stop talking and still care. They can create distance and still wonder. They can move forward and still carry a quiet tenderness for someone who changed them. That doesn't automatically mean they are ready to return. It doesn't guarantee a reunion. It doesn't mean every unresolved feeling must become a relationship again. But it does mean the emotion was real enough to survive silence. And that may be the truth that matters most. Your soulmate may now be facing a choice, even if that choice is entirely internal at first. Do they continue pretending the feeling means nothing? Or do they finally acknowledge what hearing your voice revealed? Do they dismiss the moment as nostalgia, or do they become honest about why it affected them? Do they keep the door closed because opening it feels risky, or do they at least admit that something inside them still responds to you? Those questions can take time. Sometimes the heart recognizes something long before the person is ready to act on it. And maybe that's exactly where your soulmate is right now. They may be quiet, but quiet doesn't necessarily mean indifferent. They may be distant, but distance doesn't always mean emotional absence. They may not reach out immediately, because reaching out would make the feeling real in a way that private reflection does not. So they may sit with it. They may replay the moment. They may wonder whether you noticed the significance of hearing each other again. They may wonder whether your voice sounded different because you changed, or whether it sounded familiar because some parts of the connection never really left. And perhaps the most beautiful realization is that your voice didn't need to say anything extraordinary. It didn't need to deliver a confession. It didn't need to explain the past. It simply existed for a moment, and that was enough. Sometimes the strongest emotional messages aren't spoken directly. They are hidden inside reactions. A pause, a sudden smile, a change in someone's expression. A memory that returns without warning. A feeling that arrives after years of silence and refuses to disappear immediately. That's what happened here. Your soulmate thought the emotion was gone because they had stopped seeing evidence of it. Then your voice became the evidence. It showed them that the connection had left a deeper imprint than they realized. And now they may understand something they couldn't see when you were closer. You weren't simply another person passing through their life. You became part of their emotional memory. Your voice became connected to moments, feelings, and a version of themselves they still recognize. So if you have been wondering why this moment feels strangely significant, don't focus only on whether they will come back or whether they will say something next. Focus on what the moment revealed. Something inside them responded. Something they believed was finished suddenly became present again. And sometimes that realization is the beginning of a much deeper emotional journey. Maybe they will eventually reach out. Maybe they will need more time. Maybe they will simply carry this realization quietly for a while. But one thing has already happened that they cannot completely undo. They heard you again, and for a moment the distance disappeared. The past became present. The feeling returned, and the person they thought they had emotionally placed behind them suddenly felt close enough to touch again. Perhaps that's why they are still thinking about it now. Not because your voice was simply familiar, but because it reminded them of something their mind had tried to forget, and their heart had quietly kept. And maybe the real message hidden inside that moment is this. Sometimes you don't discover that you still love, miss, or care about someone by thinking about them. Sometimes you discover it when you hear their voice again and realize your heart never needed to be reminded who they were. It already knew.